There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a television studio just before the curtain parts. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of anticipation. Thousands of people collectively holding their breath, leaning forward in their living rooms across America, waiting for something that, after 30 years, still felt new every single night. That something was Johnny Carson. And what he did in that silence, in those first few seconds before a word was spoken, was already a kind of comedy that no writer's room could manufacture. From 1962 to 1992, Johnny Carson hosted NBC's Tonight Show, and in doing so, became the most trusted man in American late-night television. Not the loudest, not the most provocative, not the most shocking, the most trusted. Viewers across the country invited him into their bedrooms every weeknight, propped their pillows, dimmed their lamps, and let Carson be the last voice they heard before sleep. That is a relationship of remarkable intimacy, and Carson understood it with an almost mathematical precision. But trust alone does not explain the legend. What transformed Carson from a reliable host into an immortal figure of American comedy was his extraordinary, almost supernatural gift for humor. Not humor that was written for him, rehearsed until polished smooth, and delivered like a piece of machinery. Real humor. The kind that erupts from a collision of the planned and the unplanned, the scripted and the chaotic, the prepared and the utterly surprising. Carson did not chase funny moments. He waited for them, perfectly still, perfectly calm, and then, when they arrived, he caught them like a man who had been born with a net in his hands. This script is a tribute to the funniest jokes, the most unforgettable comedic moments, and the greatest unscripted exchanges ever to grace the Tonight Show stage. It is a journey through 3 decades of laughter, told in the order not of dates, but of significance, beginning with the moments that defined Carson's relationship with his audience, moving through his legendary interactions with the comedians who loved and challenged him, and ending with the quiet, almost philosophical understanding of comedy that only a master accumulates across 30 years of nightly practice. To appreciate the depth of Carson's humor, you must first understand the world into which it was born. Late-night television in 1962 was a relatively modest enterprise. There were no social media clips to chase, no viral moments to engineer, no algorithm to satisfy. There was only a desk, a curtain, a band, and a studio audience. Within those constraints, Carson built something that has never quite been replicated, a comedy universe governed by genuine spontaneity, authentic reaction, and the radical willingness to let real life be funnier than anything a writer could invent. Every great comedian has a relationship with failure. The ones who become legends are not those who avoid it, but those who wear it like a second suit, comfortable, familiar, and occasionally more impressive than the first. Johnny Carson's relationship with the failed joke was one of the most sophisticated and entertaining in the history of American comedy. The Tonight Show monologue was Carson's nightly handshake with the audience. 8 to 10 minutes of topical humor delivered directly to the camera, a ritual that began each show like a prayer and sometimes ended like a confession. Carson wrote with his team, he prepared, he practiced, and then he walked out in front of millions of people and sometimes fell completely flat. The difference between Carson and every other host who has ever stood behind a microphone is what he did in those moments of flat silence. He did not push through. He did not pretend the joke had landed. He did not look at his cards and move on as if nothing had happened. Instead, he stopped. He turned to face the camera. He raised an eyebrow with the precision of a surgeon, and he looked directly into the lens with an expression that communicated, clearly and without a single word, something along the lines of, "Yes, I know. I heard it too." Then came the line that audiences came to love almost as much as the jokes themselves. How many of you actually like that joke? Let's see a show of hands. The camera would cut to the audience, where someone, always one brave soul, might raise a hand, and the resulting laughter would shake the building. Carson had performed a kind of comedic alchemy, transforming base metal into gold, turning a failed joke into a successful one through the simple act of honest acknowledgement. On one particularly brutal evening in the mid-1970s, Carson delivered what witnesses described as 5 consecutive jokes that received almost no audience response. By the third, the studio had gone quiet in a way that would have sent most performers into a tailspin. Carson simply looked at his note card, looked at the audience, looked at the note card again, and then placed it face down on his desk as though retiring it from active duty. He then shuffled into his famous soft shoe, a vaudeville-inspired dance performed with exaggerated, self-mocking dignity, humming tunelessly to himself while the audience, recognizing this beloved ritual, erupted into the kind of laughter the original jokes had never earned. The soft shoe was Carson's physical poetry. It said everything a comedian could ever want to say about the nature of live performance. Sometimes you prepare, and sometimes the universe has other plans, and the only thing left to do is dance. It was simultaneously self-deprecating and confident, an admission of defeat delivered with such style that it became a victory. Carson also had a verbal arsenal for monologue disasters. His most celebrated recovery line, delivered with the timing of a man who had been building to it his entire career, was the simple, devastating, "I'm in show business, folks. I'll be here till Thursday. Try the veal." This reference to the old Borscht Belt comedy circuit did something remarkable. It repositioned Carson not as a television star momentarily humbled, but as a working comedian doing his rounds, entirely at peace with the unpredictability of the craft. What made these recovery moments so deeply funny was not just the lines themselves, but the philosophy they revealed. Carson genuinely believed, and demonstrated nightly, that authenticity was more entertaining than perfection. He understood that the audience was not watching him to see flawlessness. They were watching him to feel connected to something real, something human, something that could fail and laugh at its own failure, and get back up and try again. In this, he was not just a comedian. He was a teacher. Among all of Johnny Carson's recurring characters, none was more beloved, more reliable, or more capable of producing the specific kind of laughter that makes your sides ache for the rest of the evening than Karnak the Magnificent. Karnak was Carson's alter ego, a turban mystic from the East who claimed the ability to divine the answers to questions sealed inside hermetically sealed envelopes without opening them. The structure of the bit was precise, almost ritualistic. Karnak would hold the envelope to his turban-covered head, intone the answer with solemn authority, then tear open the envelope and read the question aloud. The comedy lived entirely in the gap between the answer and the question. The more absurd and unexpected the connection, the bigger the laugh. Ed McMahon's role in the bit was equally essential. He served as the foil, the straight man who would introduce Karnak with excessive grandeur, and then suffer the mystic's withering insults whenever the laughter dipped. The chemistry between Carson and McMahon during these segments was so perfectly calibrated that even weak jokes seemed stronger for the warmth surrounding them. But no Karnak moment in the entire history of The Tonight Show matched what happened on one particular evening in 1974, and what made it legendary was not a perfect joke well delivered. It was the complete and total destruction of Johnny Carson's legendary composure by a joke that, on paper, should have been merely amusing. Karnak held the envelope to his forehead with customary solemnity. He closed his eyes. He intoned the answer, "Sis boom ba." He tore open the envelope, removed the card, and read the question in the measured tones of a man revealing cosmic truth, described the sound made when a sheep explodes. What followed was something that Tonight Show viewers had almost never witnessed in 30 years of watching the most controlled man in television. Carson began with a small sound, barely a chuckle, more like a catch of breath, and then descended rapidly into full, uncontrollable, helpless laughter. He tried to compose himself. He picked up the next envelope. He glanced at McMahon, whose own booming laugh was no help whatsoever, and immediately lost whatever ground he had recovered. He slumped forward onto his desk, shoulders moving in rhythms he could not control, turban slightly askew. When he finally looked up, his face was wet with tears. The audience, who had been laughing at the joke, was now laughing at something far rarer and more precious, the spectacle of their unflappable host, the man who had maintained professional poise through animal attacks, political bombshells, and 30 years of live television surprises, completely and utterly undone by the image of an exploding sheep. It took nearly 2 full minutes, an eternity in television time, for Carson to regain enough control to continue. Even then, occasional tremors of fresh laughter interrupted the next several jokes. At one point he managed to gasp, "I'm sorry. I genuinely don't know why that struck me the way it did." This honest bewilderment at his own reaction was the final touch that made the moment perfect. He wasn't performing surprise. He was genuinely surprised. And in that surprise, 30 years of immaculate professionalism became more endearing than it had ever been. Comedy writers have spent decades attempting to analyze why that particular joke broke Carson in a way that thousands of others never had. The most persuasive theory is that it was the combination of the utterly innocent source, the familiar rhythmic cheerleader chant, with the completely surreal and violent image it was made to describe. The collision was so unexpected, so perfectly engineered by the joke's anonymous writer, that it bypassed Carson's considerable professional defenses entirely and hit him somewhere deeper and more helpless. It was in the truest sense a perfect joke, not because it was the cleverest ever written, but because it found the one man most unlikely to lose control and made him lose it completely. April 27, 1965 is a date that lives in the permanent archive of American comedic history, not because of anything that was planned, written, rehearsed, or prepared, but because of a tomahawk that went somewhere nobody expected, and a man who found, in that unexpected destination, the single most perfectly timed joke of his career. The guest was Ed Ames, the actor known for playing Mingo, the Native American character on the popular television series Daniel Boone. Ames had arrived on the Tonight Show stage to demonstrate a practical skill he had developed for the role, tomahawk throwing. The prop team had wheeled out a large wooden silhouette of a cowboy, and Ames, with the confidence of a man who had done this many times before, took his position, drew back, and released. The tomahawk sailed across the stage with the clean arc of genuine expertise and landed with a solid, definitive thud, not in the torso of the wooden cowboy. Not near the head, not in the shoulder, but squarely, unmistakably, and with what seemed like geometric precision between the figure's legs. The audience registered what had happened in a single collective gasp that immediately gave way to building laughter, the kind that starts in the stomach and works outward in waves. The camera found Carson's face at the exact moment he processed the scene. What it captured was something that no acting coach could teach: the real-time journey of a man moving from observation to recognition to the dawning awareness that something unprecedented had just occurred and that he was in possession of the greatest single comedic opportunity of his career, if only he could find the right words. He let the laughter build. This was itself an act of genius. A lesser comedian would have rushed to fill the silence with a joke, afraid that the moment would pass. Carson understood that the moment was still growing, that the audience needed a few more seconds to fully appreciate what they were seeing, and that the joke would land harder if it arrived after the anticipation had peaked rather than during it. He waited. He surveyed the tomahawk. He looked at Ames. He looked at the tomahawk again. Then, with the deadpan gravity of a man delivering a solemn verdict, he said, "I didn't even know you were Jewish." The studio did not merely laugh. It detonated. Ed Ames doubled forward. The audience reached a volume that reportedly startled crew members in hallways outside the studio. And Carson, for once, nearly lost his own composure, a small smile breaking through the deadpan mask before he could fully restore it. What followed was equally delightful. Every time Carson approached the target to remove the tomahawk, which any reasonable production would have done immediately, fresh laughter erupted from the audience. Eventually, recognizing that the tomahawk had become its own comedic performer, Carson simply left it in place and conducted the rest of the interview in its company, occasionally glancing back at it as though checking on an old friend. Each glance triggered renewed laughter. NBC executives who had initially worried about the risque nature of both the visual and Carson's response were reportedly astonished when viewer calls and letters praised the moment unanimously as the hardest they had laughed in years. The clip would be replayed on anniversary specials for decades and is still, to this day, considered one of the finest examples of spontaneous comedic timing in the history of American television. It was not the joke that made the moment. The moment made the joke. And Carson's genius was knowing, in a fraction of a second, exactly what the moment required. Johnny Carson was not merely a host. He was a curator. Over 30 years, he assembled on his stage a gallery of comedic talent that represented every style, every speed, every tradition, and every vision of what American comedy could be. But what distinguished Carson from every other curator of talent in television history was what he did when the talent arrived. He stepped back. He made room. He handed over his own show with a generosity that few people in positions of power ever demonstrate, because he understood something essential, that his audience did not tune in to see him control the conversation. They tuned in to see what happened when real comedic genius was given space to breathe. Don Rickles represented one extreme of the spectrum, the comedian as demolition artist. Rickles would arrive for his scheduled appearances, embrace Carson warmly, and then immediately begin dismantling him with the cheerful savagery of a man who had been sharpening his insults since before Carson arrived at the studio. He targeted everything: Carson's multiple marriages, his wealth, his friendships, his hair. "Nobody really likes you, Johnny," Rickles would declare with the confidence of a prosecutor who has already won. "They just want to be on television." Carson would lean back in his chair, cigarette in hand, and laugh harder than anyone in the room, harder than the audience, harder than McMahon, sometimes hard enough that the cigarette had to be set aside. This willingness to be publicly and repeatedly demolished by Rickles was not merely Carson's tolerance for abuse. It was a strategic and deeply secure choice. Carson understood that allowing Rickles full reign, giving him complete authority to attack the king in the king's own castle, produced comedy that could not be replicated in any controlled setting. The jokes landed harder because they were aimed at the most powerful man in the room. The laughter was bigger because the target was Carson himself. By surrendering his dignity, Carson generated more laughter than he ever could have protected. Rodney Dangerfield brought an entirely different energy, the comedian as sympathetic disaster. Where Rickles attacked outward, Dangerfield aimed every joke inward at himself, at the cosmic injustice of his existence, at the universe's apparent determination to deny him basic human respect. His machine gun delivery of self-deprecating observations, "I tell you I get no respect. I told my doctor I broke my arm in 2 places. He told me to stop going to those places," created a rhythm so relentless that the audience could barely catch breath between laughs. During Dangerfield's appearances, Carson would perform a remarkable transformation. He would essentially remove himself from the scene, leaning back in his chair, nearly disappearing from the camera's frame, becoming an audience member at his own desk. His reaction shots during these sets became legendary in their own right, eyes streaming with tears, fist occasionally pounding the desk when a joke hit especially hard, the helpless posture of a man who has been completely overtaken by someone else's comedy, and is, in this moment, entirely content with that situation. After one particularly relentless sequence of one-liners, Carson attempted to resume his hosting duties and managed only the beginning of a question, "Do you?" before dissolving again. When he finally recovered sufficiently to complete the thought, "Do you write all these yourself?" Dangerfield replied without a millisecond of hesitation, "No, Johnny. I pay a guy to follow me around and get no respect for me." Carson collapsed again. These interactions revealed something that is easy to overlook in a discussion of Carson's own comedic gifts, his extraordinary generosity as a performer. Many hosts before and since have felt the need to remain the funniest person in the room, to top their guests' jokes, to maintain dominance over the comedic conversation. Carson not only resisted this impulse, he seemed genuinely unaware that it existed. When someone funnier than him was on his stage, he was simply happy to be there. This absence of ego was itself a form of wisdom, and audiences felt it instinctively.